Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron. So one of the things that I've got the joy of being tasked with multiple times in my career was building a proof of concept. And that's great because you get to kind of work on something that you're like, I think this is going to work, but I'm not sure how. I really can't quote level of effort if I don't even know how it's going to work. And
Yep.
I can run this through real quick and put together some technologies. I know that we've done it together on multiple projects we've worked on too. And there's like, hey, could you make some middleware to connect these two larger enterprise systems? And you're like, probably.
Maybe.
So like, let me do a proof of concept. And so I put a lot of those together. And one of the things that really chaffs me though.
Well, wait a second. You just said joy. So first of all, is your joy sincere or is it sarcastic joy?
No, it's joyful up until it's done.
Okay, got it. Okay, continue.
And so this has happened to me multiple times. I'm sure it's probably happened to listeners too, where you show the proof of concept to the stakeholders and they're like, cool, let's put it in production. You're like, oh boy, no. This is very junky code. It just barely works. And what they hear is, well, it's done. You show me that it works.
You said barely works, but it works.
Yeah, it works. We're not going to waste time. Like you already did the work. We're not going to waste time to do it again. And so we're just going to put it out there. And I think it's really hard unless you've developed a good relationship with your business to explain to them that just because something works doesn't mean it's going to work long term. It'll actually cause more headaches. It'll cost more money to work on. It might go down and erode customer trust. Like you really have to kind of work through those conversations with your stakeholders for them to understand that you're not just trying to waste time and build it again, right?
Sure, right. So just to kind of make sure we're on the same page, like when we're talking proof of concept, it is functioning code. Like so, it is something that you could. It's not like wireframes or mockups, but it is something like you could theoretically ship to production, which I guess is the problem we're talking about. But it's done purely as like an exploration. To figure out like maybe there's 3 different ways of doing this, which is the right one. But it's so from the developer perspective, you're saying this is never intended to go live. It's meant to be thrown away. But from the stakeholder perspective, they see it and they're like, let's go live with that. And so that disconnect is what we're trying to solve here.
Yeah. And when you say like it's just kind of real quick code, maybe there's no error handling. So it's just like set up to run in a perfect scenario. And because you're in, a lot of times proof of concepts are in very small environments too.
Yeah.
So if we take 1% of our traffic and run it through this proof of concept, did it work? Yes. But that doesn't mean it's going to handle 100% of the traffic all the time without errors. Maybe there's no unit tests or anything like that. So you just kind of like, you got it to work once and you're like, now if no one touches this ever,
right,
and we don't put any traffic through it, it works like I've just shown you.
This carefully constructed demo, I can show it working.
Yeah. This is great. So you want to make our base out of just binding wire and bubblegum. Awesome. So the issue then becomes like, so what do I do then when I'm building proof of concepts if I'm afraid that sort of thing might happen? Because, there's a lot of people that like to talk, and we've talked sometimes too, like, well, you just tell them no. Well, it depends on where you are personally in your career, what political capital you have, do you have savings account that you can not have the job if they freak out?
Right.
There's all these different things the way. So sometimes the answer isn't you tell them no and we do it the right way. Sometimes you just can't do that.
Yeah.
And I hate when people give that advice. Just do it the right way. It's like, well, yeah, okay. That's
and even if that's the ultimatum you get to, like if there's a way to prevent getting to that point, I think that's a smarter strategy anyways.
Yeah. And that's why people think you're so friendly versus me that so what are some of the techniques that we'll do? And this actually is funny because this idea was inspired off of a proof of concept me and you did together. And I saw the code and I was just, you might not know this, I was very, very angry because it was basically we were doing some proof of concept with some Stripe stuff.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. And it wasn't even in controllers. It was like right all in the routes file. I'm like, oh, I can't even like, my idea was at least I would copy some of this and like put it into the real app or whatever. I'm like, and they're just passing things around like out of the request directly. And I'm like, what are you doing?
See what I did?
Like,
I headed you off from using my proof of concept in any way, shape, or form.
So number one, do it so bad that other team members can't copy it.
Exactly.
But I thought we would talk today a little bit about like what are some of the things that you can kind of do along the way when you know this might be a danger, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't want to invest too much time in making a great, huge, level of application development that we would in a normal app. But there are some tips along the way that we can do on our proof of concepts that will get us to at least a better point if we are kind of forced to throw those into the mix into production.
I'm excited to hear your wisdom, Aaron.
Oh, I thought you were going to add them.
Oh, you're setting this up. Okay. Now, Joel, tell us how to do that. I gave you my tip. My tip is just to make the code so unpalatable that it would never be considered.
So the first thing I do is so imagine I'm going to go on some more specifics.
Okay.
So imagine that you're doing a proof of concept between like your core platform and a payment vendor, and you know that there might be more than one payment vendor in the future, and those things might change and all that kind of stuff. You could just write for your one payment method, one vendor, and put it like all in the block of code and call it good. But if you've been doing programming for a while and you know about PHP design patterns, things like that, you might go and say, I want to make a strategy class. And then that way I can put in different versions of different strategies for different payment vendors.
Yeah.
Well, doing that whole thing right now is way overkill because you don't even know if this is going to work. Sure. But there's that middle ground, right? So you go and you see this idea of like you have your main code block, and then you can take all the stuff that's specific to your vendor and just put it in like a private or protected method instead. So your main workflow then calls this method, which does, again, just hard-coded work for your one vendor, let's just say Stripe, and returns an object or a set of values that the rest of the main workflow can work with. So the idea there is that it's kind of good progress in a way. You've kind of broken up the code, but the idea would be then if you get to a point where you want to start refactoring things to add more, now you only have this one small little method, which you can take all that code and extract it into a strategy, and then build on different ones. So the main workflow that we know is kind of working now, it's still going to call that protected or private method. And then that's just going to use different strategy classes to, return the sets of values. And you start to encapsulate that information into smaller segments. And right away, it should be digging in your head like, well, if we have those all in little strategy classes, that means that you're getting it set up to run as, in unit tests and all that kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So that's probably the first thing I do is when you're running through this stuff and kind of thinking about this, think about like, where are the places that I might maybe encapsulate or change into something more complex if this was the highest quality of app, and go a middle route on planning that. Like we don't want to go too far because you're not going to need that, right? But you just don't want to just vomit all the code out in one straight line either.
So just to make sure I'm tracking, your strategies are less about trying to head off the business person from using this proof of concept and more just like mitigating the fact that when they inevitably want to do it, it's not going to be as horrible because you've kind of built in some points of extension, or you haven't painted yourself completely in a corner for something meant to be thrown away. You're making it where, like you said, that middle ground where, okay, all right, now we have to make this real. Here are the 10 places that I can logically start by making this more of a production app. Is that correct? Okay, cool.
Yeah, you're right. Because I personally think it's really difficult, especially when you're in the earlier part of your career, to find footing to say no.
Yeah, so it's preparing for the inevitable, but not preparing so much that you're actually slowing down the proof of concept significantly. Right. Okay, I like that. Good tip.
A second thing that we can do along this proof of concept path is doesn't really take that much time, and we've actually talked about this before, is you can set up your unit test stuff and just write the names of the methods that indicate what you would test if you were.
Okay.
And just mark them as incomplete or to do or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
Because again, like when you come back and look at this, there's a whole bunch of stuff you're going to have to spin up in your head to understand, like, how does this work again? And because that's also been my experience when you do proof of concept, it's like, oh, that's awesome. Let's put it in production. You're like, no, you have to put it in production and you could take it away onto something else. And then something happens on this broken piece of code that never should have been there, 3 months later. And you're like, how does this work again?
Sure.
It doesn't even look like something I would write because I didn't write it to be kept,
So just maybe this is a tangent, but like would for sure I get the incomplete or to do tests. Would you ever leave comments in the code? Like would the comment be like those extension points you're talking about, or would you go beyond that and be like, all right, if this ever makes it to production, do this, and this?
I mean, I'd like to say that those matter, but
Yeah.
they don't.
You mean just that you'll ignore it later?
Yeah, in my experience, the only good sort of comments, and I love comments, but are to explain like a workflow that isn't incredibly clear. So a lot of times when you're working on like a good quality piece of code, like you work on your unit tests and you refine this code until it looks so simple and elegant that you're like, wow, this looks like it was easy to write. When you know that it took a lot of time to make it look like it was easy.
Right.
And so during that process, you can write kind of comments and explain things that aren't so clear yet.
Yeah.
Or why did you do things? But I've many times wrote notes that said, I'm going to do this later if you're going to do this. More often than not, you're too precise or you're not right on what's actually going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
And if you're continuing to be good at your craft, you probably know an even better way to do what you're saying needs to be done by the time you come back to this code.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I've written notes in the past that said, "Oh, do this." When I come back, I'm like, "Why would you ever do that?"
Yeah,
it's a bad idea.
It's always been funny to inherit a code base from somebody else, and you'll see to do comments, and then you look in the Git history, and that to do is 7 years old. You're like, "Yeah, that's never getting done."
Yeah,
so, fair point. Fair point.
And then the third and final sort of thing is kind of a sort of planning thing after this has made it to production, because it's going to go there. And we wished it didn't. We tried. It's gone there.
We're just too good. It just makes it to production every time.
Yeah. Why doesn't the rest of your stuff go this fast then?
Yeah.
It is once it's there and you're going to be asked to add new features or fix things or whatever, you have to work in sort of your maintenance on this project then. And so we're not talking about totally rewriting things for things that aren't happening, but there are areas that, like now that it's in production, this should be done differently, put some error handling in there or whatnot.
Yeah.
So every sort of thing that they ask you to do, you need to work in like 50% more time just to start to build this thing up for them. Because in a perfect world, we like to say that, yeah, they should understand these risks. And if it goes down, it's their business. But if you've been doing it for as long as we have, you know that when it goes down, it's their business, but it's your fault.
Yeah.
And so you have to go and you have to, depending on what kind of contract you have to go and fix it. Maybe when you like to be having your time off or not, and it's like, well, you shouldn't have wrote such broken proof of concept work. But anyway, is the idea, like I said, to plan in these additional things. And it's like, okay, could you add on this one integration? Sure, that's going to take X amount of time, which involves, doing that integration and adding error handling. And then the next thing is, and then adding logging and then writing out these unit tests and, and sort of build on that. So you just kind of have to claw back some of that stuff after it's been into production. And it's important for you as a professional to know that you just have to do that. That's part of your job.
Yeah, I really like all of those strategies, Aaron. So, again, greenfield, perfect scenario. This would never happen. But hopefully these tips will save you some heartache down the road if you find yourself in this situation.
So I got a problem with birds.
Okay.
I mean, okay. So I grew up on more of a farming area and we had chickens. And I remember, sometimes you'd have to throw stuff into the chicken coop or bring in, various straw and mix of stuff to kind of give them a bedding. And there's a rooster in there and a bunch of hens. And every time I'd open that door to kind of put some stuff in there, that rooster would be like, "Oh, it's on." He'd just be like, he'd come at me and like, making his rooster sounds. I'm not going to try to make a rooster sound right now because I know it's going to come out bad. It's like whenever I try to do an accent and you're like, "What was that?" I'm like, "I don't know."
I can really do that.
Mini stroke.
Okay.
So I just, it's clearly seared into my mind. This one time, this stupid rooster was like, jumps up on the wheelbarrows. I'm like, trying to dump it in there. I was like, "You want to fight?" I'm screaming his rooster sounds. And I panicked. I was a teenager and I'm like, if the rooster gets up, my mom's going to be so mad. So I did the only thing that you possibly can do when a rooster's jumped on your wheelbarrow threatening you is punch it right in the face. Just
rooster. Oh, they have pointy faces?
Yeah. I was apparently I was a good aim when I was younger.
Yeah, nice.
I've none of those athletic skills now, and just punched them in there. But it got me thinking about all the other like weird bird run-ins that we end up having. I don't know if it's
you say
like
we, but don't drag me into this.
Well, I think you have run-ins here.
Okay.
Like the other day, I was walking in a park with my friend, and there's a bunch of Canadian geese, and they're protected, so you can't like mess with them. But there's just so many of them now, especially around water in our area. And so we're walking, and they're on the pathway. I'm like, I guess we now have to leave the pathway because of all the geese. And, so I'm just quietly walking around them. And she looks at the goose and she's like, don't you give me attitude. I'm like, don't talk to the goose.
Oh my God, contact.
Yeah. And the goose is like, and starts hissing at her. And I'm like, I've never seen a goose hiss. Like, what do you do? She's like, stop it. Don't you hiss at me. I'm like, stop doing that. I don't want to be attacked by a goose. But, she's like, oh, they've bitten me in the back of the leg. I'm like, yeah, because you yell at them. But I was getting my punch ready.
You were prepared. You're like, I've dealt with this before. So Aaron, can I just ask you a question with your deep farming experience? I just remember the other day I was Googling something, and you know how you start typing into autocomplete and then it like fills out the question?
Yeah.
I don't remember what my question was, but I typed something like "are eggs," and it auto-completed "are eggs dairy?" And I'm like, why would you think eggs are dairy? Is that
what?
Maybe because they're both on a farm, but
no.
At least in my Google experience, that is the first autocomplete when you type "are eggs dairy?"
So for over 75 years, I've been writing a blog on my personal website, aaronsaray.com. So you can check that out for articles about programming, business, maybe the last 7-10 years.
I haven't been blogging for 75 years, but I do have 75 years of PHP experience. And you can read about that at joelclaremont.com.